We continue now at the top of Daf Samech Aleph and Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 60a. On the previous Summit, the Gemara brought a statement from Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef Amar Rav Yochanan that with regards to the Minchas Chote and the Mincha of the Sota, one is not supposed to put on Levona, one is not supposed to put on frankincense, one is also not supposed to put on Shemen. And the statement of Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef Amar Rav Yochanan was that with regards to the Levona, one is not allowed to place a kezayis of Levona even on a mashu, on the smallest amount of the Mincha. And the Gemara explained on the previous Summit, the reason why by the Levona it has to be at least a kezayis is because the pasuk says v'nosan oleh Levona, it has to be a nesina, it has to be a kezayis, but then it says oleho, it says upon it, and it says that also by the Shemin, so essentially it says that twice, and so therefore Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef Amar Rav Yochanan continues, have a riboy achariboy, that's an inclusion after an inclusion. Since it says oleho, then it says oleho again, it says oleho by the Shemin, and it says oleho again by the Levona, that's an inclusion after an inclusion, and the rule is ve'ein riboy achariboy ela l'mayit. Anytime you have an inclusion following another inclusion, it actually is an exclusion, and therefore again even the smallest amounts of the mincha. And Rashi explains first, have a riboy achariboy degabe shemen ksiv oleha. By the shemen it says oleha. Tahainu kezayis. Now that refers to a kezayis. Vegabe levona ksiv oleha. But then it says it again by levona demashma adi kashira. Again, it sounds like there has to be a shear, but again we say in riboy achariboy ela l'mayit, and therefore there is no shear. And Rashi continues, Belavona ksiv nesina. It says nesina by levona, as we said. Unesina bekazayis. Nesina has to be a kazayis. Kidachsiv, as it's written in the pasuk, v'nasan lakoin es hakodesh, like it says v'nasan lakoin, uveyahi nesina ksiva achila. By that particular nesina where it says that, so it says the word achila. V'chol achila bekazayis. And anytime you have achila, that's a kazayis. And Rashi continues, Aleo mashma de v'mincha nami bo'inan kazayis. Again, the word Aleo sounds like by the mincha also again needs to be a kazayis. But have a riboy achariboy, that's an inclusion after an inclusion. Degabe shemen ksiv oleh, dahainu kazayis v'gabe levona oleh. Again, it says by shemen oleh and levona oleh. So have a riboy achariboy, that's a riboy achariboy. V'yenu ela l'mayit, and therefore it's an exclusion. Degabe levona lo bo'inan kazayis mincha. By levona we don't require a kazayis of mincha. De'al mashu nami chayiv. Even on the smallest amount of the mincha, one is going to be chayiv, one will be liable. And the Gemara continues, V'ika di'amri, and there are those that say another version of the above discussion. Amar Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef, Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef says, Boy Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yochanan asked the following question. In this version, it's not a statement from Rabbi Yochanan, it's a question from Rabbi Yochanan. Nasan mashu shemen al gabi kazayis mincha ma'u. If one places the smallest amount of oil upon the kazayis of the mincha, what's the halacha? Mi bo'inon sima kinesina. Do we need it to be a kazayis? It says by the shemen lo yosim ole shemen. It says sima, but maybe that's the same as nesina. Oh, lower, maybe not. Maybe it's not the same. Take when the Gemara leaves that as a question. And Rashi explains, Mi bo'inon simo de shemen dumya de nesinas levona. Maybe the simo, the placement of the oil, needs to be similar than the nesinas levona, the placement of the levona, where they use the word nesina. De lo mechayev ela bekazayis. There we know that one is only liable by kazayis, ilo, or maybe that is not the case. Again, that is the question of Rabbi Yochanan in this version. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Nosan shemen al shioreo. It says that if the shemen is placed on the remainder of the mincha, that's also going to be a problem again by the minchas chote or the mincha of the sota. And the Gemara says, Tanu Rabban, and the sages taught in a brisa, Lo yosim oleh shemen v'lo yitin. It says one cannot place upon it oil, and one cannot place. Again, it goes on to talk about the levona. But the Gemara, the brisa says, Yachol b'shnei kohanim. Now one might think that this is talking about two kohanim. Rashi explains, Yachol b'shnei kohanim. There's not going to be a liability of violating the two negative commandments. Maybe you have to have two kohanim do this. Echad nosein shemen v'echad nosein levona. One is the one that places the oil, and one places the levona. Aval chad kohen, but let's say it would just be one kohen. Lo mechayev el chad lav. Then maybe it would only be a violation of one negative commandment. It would not be a violation of two negative commandments. Maybe one might think again b'shnei kohanim specifically. There's two violations by two kohanim. Talmud lomar oleho. The pasuk says oleho, and the brisa continues begufa shel mincha kasem medaber. We're talking about the mincha itself, v'lo bekohen, but the pasuk is not talking about the kohen. Rashi explains begufa shel mincha kasem medaber, meaning teluyin shnei halavin. The two negative commandments, they're dependent upon the mincha. Kevan shenosan shemen u'levona al hamincha, meaning once a person placed the oil and the levona on the mincha, chayiv shtayim, he will be liable for violating two negative commandments. Lo shnachad, it doesn't matter if it's one kohen, v'lo veloshna train. It doesn't matter if it is two kohanim. And so again, begufa shel mincha kosim medaber velo bekohen. And the brisa continues, yochol lo yiten kli al gabe kli. Now one might think one is not even allowed to place a vessel of oil, let's say, upon the vessel that contains the mincha. V'im nasan paslin. If he does do that, he disqualifies. Talmud lomer aleha. Again, the pasuk says aleha begufa shel mincha kosim medaber. We're talking about actually mixing the oil into the mincha, not simply placing a vessel of oil on top. Rashi explains, begufa shel mincha ad sheyarev es hashemen o halavona b'mincha. You have to actually mix the oil or the frankincense in this carbon mincha. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Yesh te'unos hagasha ve'ein te'unos tenufa. There are some carbon minchas that require hagasha, bringing close to the mizbeach, but they do not require tenufa, which is waving. And hagasha u tenufa, some require hagasha and tenufa velo hagasha, some require tenufa and not hagasha. Lo tenufa velo hagasha, some require neither tenufa nor hagasha. And the Mishnah continues, ve'elu te'unos hagasha. The following require hagasha ve'ein te'unos tenufa. They do not require tenufa waving. They require being brought close to the mizbech, but not waving, and they are as follows: minchas hasolas, the minchas hasolas, the fine flour, korban mincha, v'hamachavas, and the pan mincha, marcheshes, and the deep pan mincha, v'hachalos, and the loaves, v'harakikin, and the wafers, minchas kohanim, and the mincha that's brought by kohanim, minchas kohen Mashiach, and the mincha of the anointed kohen, the kohen gadol, and minchas nochrim, the mincha of the non-Jews, minchas noshim, the mincha of women, minchas chote, and the mincha of the sinner. All of those, they require hagasha, but they do not require tenufa. And the Mishnah continues, Rabbi Shimon says, Minchas Kohanim Minchas Kohen Mashiach, with regards to the Mincha of Kohanim or the Mincha of the Kohen Gadol, Ein Bohen Hagasha, they do not have Hagasha, so this is against the Tanakama. The Tanakama says they do require Hagasha. Rabbi Shimon says no Hagasha, they do not need to be brought close to the Mizbeach. Why? Lefi She'ein Bohen Kamitza, because there's no Kamitza taken, there's no fistful. V'chol She'ein Bohen Kamitza, anytime there is no fistful, Ein Bohen Hagasha, then there's no requirement of Hagasha, bringing it close to the Mizbeach. Rashi explains, Kol she'ein lo kmitza, again, if it doesn't have kmitza, lahatir shirayim lekohanim, meaning you're not taking the fistful, which then allows the remainder to be eaten by the kohanim, then ein lo hagasha, then there's no halach of hagasha. Kediktani bebraisa lekamon, this will be taught in the braisa later on. V'yotzu elu minchas kohanim minchas kohen Mashiach she'ein mehen lekohanim. The point is that minchas kohanim and minchas kohen Mashiach, there is none. It's not eaten. They are not eaten by the kohanim, and so therefore, in such a situation, since they are not eaten by the kohanim, there is no halacha of hagasha. And the Gemara says, Amar Rapapa says, Kol heicha d'tanan eser tanan. Anytime the Mishnah has a list like this, it has a list of 10. There were two versions, two ways of explaining this. The Gemara had the exact same Gemara on Daf Nun Tes Amud Aleph. One understanding of Rapapa is he's talking about the list of minchas that are listed in this Mishnah and the Mishnah before. There are 10 carbon minchas. Ve'elu tu'unos hagasha ve'ein tu'unos tenufa. The Mishnah then goes on to list 10 carbon minchas. That's one way of understanding this sugya. Again, we had this on Daf Nun Tes Amud Aleph. The other way is that it means to say all of these minchas require 10 loaves in terms of the mincha. In any case, whatever the meaning is of Rav Papa says it's always 10, and the point is, my kamash malon, what is Rav Papa teaching us? It's li'afuka mid Rabbi Shimon. It goes against Rabbi Shimon, because again, in the list of 10 over here, we have chalos and rekikin, which are loaves and wafers, but Rabbi Shimon says, he has a unique shita, diyamar mechza chalos and mechza rekikin yavi. He says that by the minchas ma'afeh, by the baked mincha, there's a possibility of bringing half of the loaves from chalos and half of the loaves from rekikin, from wafers, and therefore that goes against listing them the way they're listed in our Mishnah, where it's chalos, one can bring all chalos, all 10 can be chalos, or one can bring all rekikin. They don't have this possibility of mechza chalos and mechza rekikin, which is an additional possibility. Again, that's what Rabbi Shimon says. So kamash malon delo, that's what our Papa is teaching, not like Rabbi Shimon. And Rashi explains, Eser Tanan, again, 10, betray Lishni Kedefarishas Le'el. There are two ways of understanding this Gemara, and again, that was explained earlier. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Menohani Mili, from where do we know this? The Gemara is referring to the Machlokes Tanoim in the Mishnah, again, whether Minchas Kohanim and Minchas Kohen Mashiach, whether they also require Hagasha. And the Gemara says, Detan Rabbanan, that the sages taught in a Braisa. Ilu Nemar, if the Pasuk said, Ve'veisa asher yeosa me'elo la'Hashem, ve'ikriva la'kohen ve'higisha, the Pasuk just said that. The full Pasuk is, Ve'veisa samincha asher yeosa me'elo la'Hashem, ve'ikriva la'kohen ve'higisha la'mizbeach. This is the Pasuk of Hagasha, of bringing it close to the Mizbeach. Rashi explains, Ve'ivesas amincha bahu kraksiv, v'higisha l'mizbeach. Again, this is the pasuk which says, v'higisha l'mizbeach. If that's all that it said, so hayisi yomer, so I would have said, ein li shaton hagasha ela kometz bilvad. Only the kometz, only the fistful, needs to be brought close to the mizbeach. And Rashi explains, ala kometz bilvad shenasa l'Hashem, because that is l'Hashem, and that's what it says in the pasuk. It says in the pasuk l'Hashem. One would have thought this halach of hagasha applies only to the kometz. So mincha minayin, how do we know it applies to the entire mincha? Which Rashi explains, mincha shatuna hagasha kodem kmitza. The fact that mincha requires bringing close to the mizbech before the fistful is taken. How do we know that hagasha is required before the kometz is taken? Minayin, from where do we know that? Talmud lomar mincha. The pasuk says mincha, and we learn from that pasuk that it means the whole mincha. And the brayso continues, minchas chote minayin. From where do we know this applies to the minchas chote, the mincha of the sinner? Talmud lomar esa mincha. It says in the pasuk esa mincha, that comes to include the minchas chote. The brayso continues, vidinu, but it's logical. We shouldn't even need a pasuk. Nemar hacha, because it says over here, and Rashi explains, vidinu the minchas chote tuna hagasha. It's logical that minchas chote requires hagasha. V'lo tzarich kra, there's no need for a pasuk, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Amid Beis.